Part 1. Introducing the Protagonist, the black man with a culinary dream. Antoine had spent years perfecting his craft, earning the coveted 3 Michelin stars that placed him among the elite of the culinary world. His name carried weight in prestigious circles, his dishes celebrated for their balance of tradition and innovation. Yet despite the accolades, the international acclaim, and the respect of his peers, something within him felt incomplete. The fire that once burned in him, the insatiable hunger for creativity, the deep passion for discovery, seemed to have dimmed under the weight of expectation. He needed something different, something to reignite the spark that had driven him from the beginning. And so, in an unexpected decision, he found himself walking through the doors of an exclusive French cooking class, one that prided itself on preserving the purity of classical techniques. But there was a catch. He did not enter as Antoine Laurent, the world-renowned chef. He entered as just another student, stripping away his identity, his reputation, and his status. He wanted to experience the craft anew, not as a master, but as a learner. He wanted to return to the roots of his love for food, to rediscover what had once made him fall in love with the process of creation. His decision was met with surprise from those closest to him. "Why?" they asked. "You have already achieved everything." But Antoine knew that mastery was not about reaching a destination. It was about constant evolution. He had built his empire on passion, but he feared becoming too comfortable, too distant from the raw artistry that had once driven him. He did not want to be another name on a prestigious list. He wanted to cook with the same fire he had when he was a young boy in his grandmother's kitchen, standing on a stool to stir a pot, inhaling the scent of spices that carried stories older than him. So he signed up for the course under a different name, shedding the recognition and entering as an unknown. He was not there to prove anything, nor to impress. He was there to learn, to feel, and to immerse himself in an environment where he would be treated as a student, not a celebrity. What he did not anticipate was that in doing so, he would be forced to confront an uglier reality, one that had nothing to do with his skill or knowledge, but with the color of his skin. From the moment he walked into the kitchen, he felt the weight of unspoken judgment. It was in the way eyes lingered on him a second too long, the barely concealed surprise at his presence. It was in the polite but distant nods, the unspoken assumption that he did not quite belong. The class was small, exclusive, comprised mostly of individuals from prestigious culinary schools or influential families with a deep-rooted connection to the industry. They had come expecting to learn alongside people like themselves, familiar faces, familiar backgrounds. Antoine, with his deep brown skin and quiet presence, disrupted that expectation. He had faced this before, of course. Throughout his career, he had encountered skepticism, had been questioned in ways his white counterparts never were. He had walked into fine dining establishments and seen the surprise in people's eyes when they realized the man behind the celebrated cuisine was not what they had imagined. He had heard the murmurs, the condescending remarks disguised as curiosity. "Where did you train? Did you grow up cooking street food? What made you want to learn French cuisine instead of something from your background?" He had learned to navigate these moments with grace, with patience. But here, in a setting meant to foster learning and exploration, the undertone of exclusion felt different. The instructor, a well-respected French chef, introduced himself with an air of authority, his voice carrying the weight of years spent mastering his craft. Antoine listened attentively, taking in every word, every instruction. He did not expect special treatment, nor did he demand recognition. He simply wanted to be part of the process. But as the lesson progressed, it became clear that his presence unsettled something in the room. When he asked a question, the response was curt, dismissive, as if he had overstepped. When he contributed knowledge, it was met with skepticism, subtly disregarded or re-explained as though he could not possibly understand the nuances of French cuisine. When he moved through the kitchen, engaging with the ingredients with the ease of someone who had spent his life immersed in the craft, he felt the quiet tension, the whispered conversations, the exchanged glances. He was not a student here. He was an outsider, Antoine could have revealed himself then. He could have spoken up, could have reminded them that he had achieved more than most of them ever would. He could have listed his accolades, the prestigious restaurants that bore his name, the industry leaders who had sought his mentorship, but he did not. Because if he needed to validate his presence with credentials, then he had already lost something more important than recognition. He had lost the space to simply exist, to learn, without having to justify why he belonged. So, he continued. He remained quiet, observing, absorbing. He let their assumptions sit in the air, unchallenged. He was not here to fight for their approval. He was here for something deeper, something more personal. And yet, as the days passed, the weight of their perceptions pressed heavier on him. It was not just about him. It was about every aspiring chef who looked like him, about every young talent who would walk into spaces like these and be met with the same silent rejection. For all their talk of preserving the purity of their cuisine, they had failed to recognize that food, at its core, was about evolution, about influence, about the beautiful chaos of cultures intertwining. They had built walls around something that was meant to be shared, guarded it as though it belonged to them alone. And Antoine, despite all he had achieved, was still, in their eyes, on the outside of those walls. He thought of his grandmother, who had once told him, "Food does not care who cooks it. It only asks that you respect it." He had carried that philosophy with him, had built his career on it. But standing in that kitchen, surrounded by people who saw him as an anomaly rather than an equal, he realized that for some, respect was only given selectively. He had come here searching for inspiration, for a renewed sense of purpose. Instead, he found himself face to face with a truth he had always known, but had tried, in his optimism, to believe was changing. It was not just about cooking. It was about who was allowed to cook, who was allowed to be taken seriously in a world that still clung to its prejudices. And yet, Antoine did not regret his decision. Because this experience, however frustrating, had given him something more valuable than what he had initially sought. It had reminded him of why he cooked in the first place, not for the validation of others, not for awards or recognition, but for the love of the craft, for the power of food to tell stories, to break barriers, to demand that people see each other beyond the surface. He had walked into that classroom as a student. He would walk out of it as something greater, not because of what he had learned from them, but because of what they had unknowingly reminded him about himself. Part 2. Initial hostility and cold stares in the classroom. Antoine stepped into the classroom with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the gleaming countertops, the neatly arranged knives, and the rows of pristine white aprons hanging by the wall. The scent of butter, garlic, and fresh herbs lingered in the air, evoking a deep familiarity, a reminder of the countless kitchens he had worked in, from the smallest family-run bistros to the grandest Michelin-starred establishments. Yet, despite the comfort that the environment should have provided, there was an unmistakable chill in the air, one that had nothing to do with the temperature. He felt it the moment he entered. A pause, almost imperceptible but distinct, in the conversation between students. A shift in the atmosphere, an almost synchronized movement of glances exchanged, expressions stiffening ever so slightly before returning to polite neutrality. It was the kind of reaction he had learned to recognize over the years, the kind that was rarely direct but always present. The way people's gazes flickered to him, lingering just long enough to be noticeable but never long enough to be acknowledged. The way a few bodies subtly turned away, as though placing an unspoken boundary between themselves and the unfamiliar presence in the room. Antoine was not a man easily unsettled. He had walked into countless spaces where he was not expected, where he had been underestimated, doubted, dismissed before he had even spoken a word. He had long since learned that the most dangerous forms of exclusion were not the outright rejections but the quiet, unspoken ones, the ones that required no words, yet spoke volumes. And here, in this kitchen, in this prestigious French cooking class where tradition reigned supreme, he could already sense that he was an anomaly. The instructor, a distinguished chef with graying hair and a sharp, scrutinizing gaze, made his way to the front of the room. His presence commanded respect, his movements precise, his posture exuding the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades mastering his craft. He introduced himself with the measured cadence of someone who expected full attention, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and discipline. Antoine listened intently, but he could not shake the feeling that, even as the instructor spoke to the room, his gaze skimmed over him, barely acknowledging his presence. When roll call began, Antoine paid close attention, listening as each student introduced themselves. Most had backgrounds in fine dining or prestigious culinary schools, their names often accompanied by mentions of renowned restaurants or family legacies in the industry. When it was his turn, he simply stated his name and left it at that. There was no need for embellishment. He had no desire to reveal his identity, nor to use his reputation as a shield. He wanted to be judged for his skill, not for his name. Yet, as he spoke, he saw it. That flicker of hesitation in the instructor's expression, the brief narrowing of his eyes, as if trying to place the unfamiliar name, as if questioning why a man like him was here at all. The class moved forward, and Antoine took his place at one of the stainless steel workstations. The first lesson was on the fundamentals, mise en place, the precision of knife work, the delicate balance of seasoning. He moved with practiced ease, his hands finding the rhythm of the process instinctively. He could feel the eyes on him, subtle yet persistent, as if measuring whether he belonged. He noticed the small things, the way another student shifted their ingredients slightly away from his side of the counter, as if creating distance, the way a conversation at the next workstation tapered off when he approached, the way the instructor's feedback was noticeably more critical when directed at him, his tone carrying an undercurrent of skepticism that was absent when he addressed the others. Antoine was used to critique. In fact, he welcomed it. He had spent years refining his craft under the sharp eyes of some of the toughest chefs in the world, enduring the brutal honesty that came with striving for perfection in high-level kitchens. But this was different. This was not about skill or technique. This was something else, something more insidious. A quiet questioning of his place here, an expectation that he would falter, that he would reveal himself as lacking, as undeserving. He met each challenge with unwavering composure. He answered each question with clarity, executed each technique with precision. Yet, no matter how flawlessly he moved through the steps, he could sense the resistance, the reluctance to acknowledge his competence, the hesitance to afford him the same ease of belonging that the others seemed to receive effortlessly. It was a slow, deliberate exclusion, one that was not spoken, but deeply felt. At one point, the instructor demonstrated a technique for preparing a perfect beurre blanc, the classic French butter sauce that required careful control of heat and timing. Antoine followed along, his movements fluid, his instincts guiding him. When the instructor came around to inspect, he paused at Antoine's station, peering down at the silky sauce with a critical eye. Interesting, the instructor mused, though there was no real admiration in his tone. It seems acceptable, but next time, be sure not to overwork the butter. You wouldn't want the sauce to split. Antoine looked at his sauce, at its flawless texture, at the gentle sheen that indicated perfect emulsion. He knew it had not been overworked. He knew the critique was unnecessary, a subtle way to diminish his effort, to plant doubt where there was none. He simply nodded. "Of course, chef," he replied evenly. The instructor lingered for a moment before moving on, offering more generous praise to the student next to him, despite their sauce being visibly less refined. Antoine exhaled slowly, a quiet understanding settling in his chest. This was not about cooking. This was about proving something, about the burden of always having to be twice as good just to be seen as equal. About the unspoken expectation that someone like him, a black man in a space like this, had to justify his presence in a way that others never would. But he would not let it shake him. He had spent his entire career breaking expectations, dismantling assumptions, forcing the world to acknowledge his worth on his own terms. He was not here to ask for acceptance. He was here to learn, to refine, to push himself, not to seek validation from those who had already decided they would not give it. As the class ended, he cleaned his station meticulously, ensuring that every tool was returned to its place, every surface wiped spotless. He could feel the glances, the quiet observations, the weight of silent judgment that followed him as he packed his things. He walked toward the door, pausing for a moment to glance back at the room. The students, the instructor, the gleaming kitchen that held both the promise of mastery and the burden of unspoken bias. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders. He would return tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after that, because he was not just here to learn. He was here to remind them that he belonged. Part 3. Antoine's superior cooking skills are dismissed. The kitchen buzzed with focused energy, the rhythmic chopping of knives against cutting boards, the hiss of butter melting in pans, the occasional murmur of approval from the instructor as students replicated his techniques. Antoine moved with quiet precision, his hands steady, his mind sharp. Every motion was deliberate, every cut clean, every measurement precise. Cooking was his language, his craft, his art. He had spent years mastering the nuances of French cuisine, perfecting the balance of flavors, the elegance of plating, the delicate chemistry of sauces and reductions. But here, in this prestigious culinary class, his expertise was met not with admiration, but with skepticism. Each time he executed a technique flawlessly, there was no nod of approval, no acknowledgement of his skill. When other students succeeded, they were praised. When they faltered, they were encouraged. But when Antoine excelled, the instructor remained silent, offering only a glance of indifference. When he spoke, his words were met with dismissal. It was not an overt rejection, not an explicit refusal of his ability, but a quiet, steady resistance, one that was far more insidious. It became clear that no matter how well he performed, his knowledge would always be questioned in a way the others never would. "Chef, I believe the temperature for the confit should be lower to prevent the protein from seizing," Antoine said during one lesson on traditional duck confit. The instructor barely spared him a glance before responding curtly, "That's unnecessary. The recipe we follow here has been perfected over generations." Antoine knew otherwise. He had cooked this dish dozens of times, had worked alongside master chefs who had refined every aspect of the technique. But his words were not heard. His expertise was not considered. A younger student, who had been struggling to properly render the duck fat, repeated a similar observation minutes later. This time, the instructor nodded approvingly. "Yes, good observation," he said. Antoine clenched his jaw but remained silent. This was not about cooking. This was about who was speaking. Time and time again, he found his knowledge disregarded, his competence met with scrutiny rather than trust. When he worked with the others, they hesitated before taking his suggestions, often glancing toward the instructor as if seeking confirmation before acknowledging his input. When he corrected a minor misstep in a fellow student's technique, the response was a forced smile, a stiff nod, the kind of reaction reserved for someone whose advice was tolerated but not truly valued. The weight of it pressed down on him. He had anticipated resistance. He had known that stepping into this space as a black man, as someone outside the expected mold of a French culinary student, would come with challenges. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things. No matter how many accolades he had earned, no matter how many Michelin stars bore his name, he was still seen as an outsider here. During a lesson on pastry, the instructor demonstrated the lamination process for croissants, emphasizing the importance of temperature control and precise folds. Antoine followed each step effortlessly, his hands moving with practiced ease. He had learned this technique from one of the best pastry chefs in Paris, had spent countless early mornings in a kitchen rolling dough before the city had even woken up. When the croissants emerged from the oven, golden and perfectly layered, he knew they were textbook perfect. But when the instructor inspected them, he frowned. "You must have gotten lucky," he said, brushing his fingers over the crisp exterior. "Consistency is key. Let's see if you can replicate it." "Lucky." Antoine exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the insult disguised as critique. For a moment, he considered revealing who he was. He imagined the shift in expressions, the sudden reversal of opinions if they knew they were doubting a Michelin-starred chef. He imagined the way their tones would change, how the same people who dismissed him would suddenly praise him. But he did not want their respect if it was dependent on his reputation. He wanted them to see his skill for what it was, without the weight of his name. So he said nothing. Instead, he set to work again, rolling, folding, proofing. He repeated the process with the same care, the same expertise, and when the next batch emerged, it was just as perfect as the first. The instructor could not deny it this time. He only gave a stiff nod before moving on to the next student. Antoine had spent his entire career proving himself. He had thought he had moved past the point of needing to justify his presence in a kitchen. But here he was again, fighting the same silent battles. He had learned long ago that talent alone was not enough. That excellence for people like him was not just expected. It was required at a level beyond that of others. He could not simply be good. He had to be indisputably, undeniably exceptional just to be seen as competent. And even then, it was not always enough. By the end of the lesson, Antoine was exhausted, not from the physical labor, but from the unspoken burden of having to prove himself over and over again. He gathered his tools, cleaned his station, and prepared to leave. But before he could step away, one of the students approached him. "Your technique," she said hesitantly. "It's impressive." Antoine turned, raising an eyebrow. She shifted uncomfortably. She hesitated, then exhaled. "I didn't think you'd be this good." Antoine let the words settle between them. He could hear the underlying message in them, the assumption that had existed before he had even touched a knife, the quiet bias that had framed their perception of him from the beginning. But at least now she was starting to see. "Cooking doesn't care about expectations," he finally said, his voice even. "It only cares about the work you put in." She nodded slowly, as if considering his words for the first time. As he walked out of the classroom, he reminded himself why he was here. Not for validation, not for permission to belong. He was here because this was his craft, his passion, his legacy, and no one, not their skepticism, not their assumptions, could take that away from him. Part 4. The false accusation. A test of bias. The kitchen was alive with the rhythmic chopping of knives, the sizzle of oil meeting fresh ingredients, and the occasional burst of conversation between students. Antoine had spent weeks navigating the unspoken tension in this class, his skills questioned at every turn, his presence met with silent resistance. He had not come here to be admired or acknowledged. He had come for the love of his craft, to rediscover the raw passion that had fueled his journey as a chef. But it seemed that no matter how carefully he treaded, there was always an invisible barrier between him and the others. That morning, the instructor had assigned a particularly delicate dish, a classic French bisque. Every ingredient had to be precisely balanced, every step executed with care to achieve the depth of flavor that defined true mastery. Antoine worked with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this 100 times before, measuring, stirring, tasting. He adjusted the seasoning instinctively, knowing exactly when to let the flavors meld, when to reduce the heat, when to allow the soup to reach its perfect consistency. Yet, when the instructor came around to evaluate his work, there was no nod of approval, no acknowledgement of the perfectly executed dish before him. Instead, the instructor frowned, as if searching for a flaw, something to justify the lingering doubt in his expression. "It's passable," he said finally, his voice lacking the warmth he had given other students. "But I don't think you quite understand the essence of French cuisine. Your seasoning is too assertive." Antoine inhaled sharply, willing himself to stay composed. He had followed the exact method, had tasted and adjusted with the precision that had earned him Michelin stars. He knew this dish was as authentic as it could be. But his words, his experience, his expertise, they all held less weight in this room. He set his ladle down, looking the instructor in the eye. "I disagree," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This bisque follows the same principles I was taught in Paris, in kitchens where this dish has been perfected for generations. The seasoning is balanced, the texture exactly as it should be." The room fell silent. No one had openly challenged the instructor before. Some students exchanged glances, a mix of curiosity and discomfort flickering across their faces. The instructor's lips pressed into a thin line. "There is a difference between knowing the steps and understanding the soul of a dish," he said, "and I don't believe you quite understand it yet." A few students smirked, as if satisfied that Antoine had been put in his place. Antoine's fingers curled into a fist beneath the counter. He had spent years not just mastering, but honoring French cuisine. He had stood shoulder to shoulder with some of the greatest chefs in the world, had created dishes that critics had hailed as revolutionary while still respecting tradition. And yet, in this moment, he was being told he did not understand. Not because of his skill, not because of his knowledge, but because of who he was. He exhaled slowly, releasing the tension from his body. He would not let their doubts dictate his worth. Before he could say another word, the commotion at the front of the kitchen caught everyone's attention. "Has anyone seen the truffle?" one of the assistants called out, her voice edged with panic. The room stiffened. A rare, expensive truffle, meant to be used for an advanced dish later that day, had disappeared. The students murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads, others exchanging uncertain glances. The instructor's gaze swept over the room, searching for an answer. Then, almost instinctively, his eyes landed on Antoine. The weight of that look was immediate, heavy with unspoken accusation. "You were working near the truffles earlier," the instructor said, his voice dangerously even. A ripple of tension moved through the class. Antoine could feel it, the shift in the air, the way the other students subtly distanced themselves, the quiet reinforcement of suspicion. His jaw clenched. "Are you accusing me of taking it?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with disbelief. "I'm asking if you know anything about it," the instructor said. "It was here earlier, and now it's not." The implication hung thick in the air. Antoine's pulse pounded in his ears. He had faced many things in his career: competitors who doubted him, critics who underestimated him, customers who assumed his talent had limitations. But this was different. This was not about a missing truffle. This was about an assumption as old as time itself. A black man in a room full of doubt, standing before a missing object. The conclusion was already drawn. The other students said nothing. Not one of them stepped forward to suggest another possibility, to remind the instructor that they had all been working in the same space, that anyone could have misplaced it. Their silence was an answer in itself. Antoine straightened his shoulders, looking the instructor dead in the eye. "I have spent my life in kitchens where respect for ingredients is sacred. I would never take what does not belong to me." The instructor studied him for a long moment, as if searching for cracks in his composure. Then he turned to the rest of the class. "If no one comes forward, we will have to assume someone is responsible," he said. "And until we figure it out, I think it's best if certain individuals step back from today's lesson." A murmur swept through the room. Certain individuals. He did not need to say it outright. Antoine's stomach tightened. This was not just an accusation. It was a dismissal, a quiet way of removing him, of reinforcing that he did not belong here. For a moment he thought of arguing. He thought of demanding fairness, of making them see the absurdity of what was happening. But then he saw their faces, the instructor's rigid certainty, the students' unwillingness to challenge it. He saw the wall that had been built long before he had ever stepped foot in this room. And he knew. No amount of proof would be enough. Slowly, Antoine untied his apron. He did not flinch, did not let them see the anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He placed it neatly on the counter, then removed his name tag, setting it beside the apron with deliberate care. "If you've already decided I don't belong here," he said quietly, "then there's nothing more to say." He turned and walked toward the door. No one stopped him. As he stepped into the hallway, leaving behind the kitchen, the students, the instructor, he felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he did not bow under it. They had taken his place in their classroom. But they could not take his talent, his knowledge, or his love for his craft. And soon enough, they would learn exactly who they had cast aside. Part 5. Expulsion and Public Humiliation. The kitchen had fallen silent. The accusation still hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating, inescapable. Antoine stood motionless, his fingers resting lightly on the counter as if grounding himself, anchoring his emotions before they could betray him. The instructor's words echoed in his mind, the quiet implication that he was responsible for the missing truffle. Not because there was evidence, not because there was reason, but because he was the easiest suspect. He had given them his skills, his patience, his respect, and in return, they had given him doubt. The instructor cleared his throat, his voice as clipped as the edge of a knife. "Until this matter is resolved, I believe it's best that you take a step back, Antoine. Step back." The words landed harder than if they had told him outright to leave. It was a subtle dismissal, a way to cast him aside without openly admitting why. Antoine felt the heat rise to his face, but he did not let it show. Years in the culinary world had taught him to temper his reactions as carefully as he tempered chocolate, to keep the heat low, to stir gently, to control the process lest everything collapse. He had endured critics who underestimated him, restaurant owners who hesitated before giving him an opportunity, and customers who had looked at his dark skin before they had even tasted his food. But this was different. This was not a whisper behind his back, not a subtle hesitation before handing him an opportunity. This was a blatant rejection, a judgment made not on merit, but on assumption. He inhaled deeply. "I see," he said evenly. The instructor nodded, as if satisfied that Antoine wasn't going to fight back, wasn't going to make a scene. A few students exchanged awkward glances, some looking down at their cutting boards, unwilling to meet his gaze. Others didn't bother to hide their agreement with the instructor's decision. Not one of them spoke up. Antoine knew in that moment that it did not matter what he said. It did not matter that he had been nothing but respectful. It did not matter that he had demonstrated skill beyond most in the room. He had already lost in their eyes, not because he had failed, but because he had been set up to fail from the moment he walked through the door. His hands moved with quiet precision as he untied his apron, folding it neatly before placing it on the counter. Then, with the same measured movements, he removed his name tag and set it beside the apron. His actions were not rushed, nor were they done with hesitation. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him flustered, of seeing him break under the weight of their accusations. As he turned toward the door, he finally allowed himself to scan the room one last time. He saw them all clearly now, not as fellow chefs, not as peers, but as people who had failed a test they did not even know they were taking. He wondered if years from now they would look back and realize what they had done, if they would remember the moment they had chosen silence instead of fairness. When he reached the door, he paused, not out of hesitation, but to give them one final opportunity, to say something, to stop him, to recognize the injustice unfolding in front of them. No one did. He stepped out of the room. The hallway was quiet, the contrast between it and the bustling kitchen behind him almost jarring. He walked slowly, each step a deliberate act of defiance, refusing to let the weight of what had just happened slow him down. As he reached the exit, he pushed open the door and stepped into the crisp evening air. The sky above him was painted in deep shades of blue, the first stars beginning to pierce through the fading daylight. He took a deep breath, letting the coolness of the night settle into his lungs. They had shut him out, but they had not taken anything from him. His knowledge, his talent, his passion, those were things they could never strip away. If anything, this experience only solidified one thing: he was never meant to seek their validation. He had already proven himself to the world. He had already earned his place in the culinary elite. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. As his fingers hovered over the screen, he considered calling an old friend, a fellow chef who had once warned him about spaces like this. But he hesitated. This wasn't something he wanted to explain. Not yet. Instead, he scrolled through his contacts until he reached the number of a small restaurant owner, someone he had met years ago, long before Michelin stars and television appearances. someone who had always cooked for the love of food rather than for status. He dialed the number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. Antoine? What a surprise. Antoine exhaled, a small smile touching his lips. I was wondering if you needed an extra set of hands in the kitchen. The voice on the other end chuckled. Always. I'll be there tomorrow. He ended the call, slipping his phone back into his pocket. He may have left that classroom behind, but his journey was far from over. And soon, they would all know exactly who they had cast aside. Part 6. The truth emerges. The real culprit is found. The kitchen was quiet, the tension lingering in the air long after Antoine had walked out. The weight of their collective decision settled over the room, though no one dared to acknowledge it. They had dismissed him, cast him aside without question, and now they moved forward as if nothing had happened. The instructor resumed the lesson, his voice steady, his hands guiding the students through the next steps of the dish. Yet something had shifted. The energy was different. No one spoke of it, but they all felt it. Marie, a young woman who had been sitting 2 stations away from Antoine, stared at her cutting board, her fingers idly tracing patterns against the wood. She hadn't spoken up, hadn't defended him. She had known the accusation was baseless, had seen the unease in his posture when he realized he was being blamed for something he hadn't done. But she had remained silent, like the rest of them. The thought unsettled her, gnawed at her as she tried to focus on the instructor's words. She had never considered herself unfair, never thought of herself as someone who would allow injustice to unfold in front of her without a word. Yet, she had done exactly that. Across the room, another student, Mathieu, shifted uneasily. He had been the one who had first whispered about the missing ingredient, the one who had speculated aloud before realizing where his words had led. He hadn't meant to accuse Antoine directly, but the moment the instructor turned toward him, demanding an explanation, Mathieu had felt the pressure to give one. And in that moment, Antoine had become the easiest answer. The lesson continued, but the atmosphere had changed. What should have been an ordinary day in class had turned into something heavier, something that refused to be ignored. It wasn't until nearly an hour later, when the instructor moved to the supply cabinet at the back of the kitchen, that the truth revealed itself. He reached for a container of spices and, in doing so, knocked over a small bag resting behind it. The bag tumbled onto the counter, and the room fell into a collective silence as the missing ingredient, an expensive black truffle, rolled free. For a moment, no one spoke. The instructor's hand hovered over the truffle, his fingers tightening slightly before he turned to face the room. His expression darkened, not with anger, but with something else, something closer to realization. Marie's breath caught in her throat. It had been there all along. Antoine had been accused, humiliated, and forced to leave over nothing. The guilt hit her like a physical weight. The instructor swallowed, his posture stiffening. It appears there was a mistake, he said, his voice clipped, controlled. A mistake. The word felt hollow, inadequate. Mathieu let out a slow breath, dragging a hand through his hair. He looked around the room, his eyes searching for someone, anyone, who might ease the discomfort clawing at his chest. But no one met his gaze. Marie finally spoke, her voice quieter than she intended. He didn't do anything wrong. The words felt small, insignificant, but once spoken, they could not be taken back. The instructor exhaled through his nose, setting the truffle down. He looked as though he wanted to move on, to continue the lesson as if nothing had happened, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. He cleared his throat. Yes, it seems that's the case. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just a statement, empty of any real accountability. Marie's stomach twisted. We should tell him, she said louder this time. The instructor hesitated, then shook his head. He's already left. But it won't change what happened, he interrupted, his tone final. Mathieu stared at the truffle, His throat felt dry. He wanted to say something, to push back, but the words wouldn't come. He had contributed to this, whether he had meant to or not. The class continued, but the kitchen no longer felt the same. The air was thick with the weight of what they had done. The missing ingredient had been found, but something else had been lost. And the worst part was, they couldn't take it back. Part 7. A Community Confronts Its Prejudice. The weight of guilt settled heavily over the kitchen, an unspoken presence lingering in the air. The discovery of the missing truffle should have been a relief, a resolution to an unfortunate misunderstanding, but instead, it only deepened the unease spreading through the room. No one said it out loud, but they all knew. The mistake had not been in misplacing an ingredient. The mistake had been in their assumption, in how quickly they had turned on Antoine without question, in how effortlessly they had allowed their biases to dictate the outcome. The instructor had tried to move forward, had continued the lesson as if nothing had happened, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Marie could barely concentrate. The way Antoine had stood there, defending himself with calm dignity even as they cast him aside, replayed in her mind on a loop. She had seen the disbelief in his eyes when they accused him, the flicker of hurt he had quickly masked behind quiet restraint. She had done nothing to stop it. None of them had. Mathieu's stomach churned with unease. He had been the one to first suggest that Antoine might have taken the truffle, though he hadn't meant it as an accusation. It had just been an idle remark, a passing observation. But the moment it was spoken, the instructor and the others had seized on it. He had watched Antoine's face shift, had seen the brief hesitation before he defended himself, yet he had stood by and let it happen. Now, faced with the truth, he felt the weight of his own cowardice pressing down on him. The instructor, too, seemed changed. Though he had brushed past the incident with a clipped acknowledgement of the mistake, his movements lacked their usual confidence. He was an experienced chef, a man who had spent decades in kitchens, teaching and mentoring, yet he had let himself be swept up in the wave of suspicion. He had been the one to ask Antoine to leave, the one to insist that the class needed order and that there was no room for distractions. Now, standing in front of his students, he could feel their eyes on him, filled with something close to expectation. They were waiting for him to make it right. But how did one undo something like this? How did you take back a moment of betrayal? Marie finally broke the silence. We need to tell him. The instructor turned, his expression unreadable. Tell him what? That we found the truffle. That he didn't do anything wrong, she said, her voice firmer now. The instructor hesitated, then exhaled through his nose. He's already gone. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, Mathieu added, stepping forward. His voice wavered slightly, but there was resolve in his stance. It's not just about finding the truffle, it's about what we did. The class shifted, murmurs rippling through the room. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked away, unwilling to meet the weight of the moment. It was one thing to acknowledge their mistake internally, but to seek Antoine out, to admit to him that they had been wrong, that required a level of humility few were willing to embrace. The instructor ran a hand over his face, as if wiping away his own discomfort. You think an apology is going to change what happened? Marie straightened. Number? But it's the least we can do. The instructor's jaw tightened. He wasn't a man who often admitted fault, wasn't someone who sought out redemption for every misstep. In his world, the kitchen moved fast, and mistakes were things to be learned from, not dwelled on. But as he looked around at his students, he could see that this wasn't something they could simply brush aside. With a sigh, he nodded. Fine. Let's find him. The decision set the class into motion. They moved quickly, retrieving their coats, hurrying out of the kitchen and into the city streets. Antoine hadn't gone far. They had a general idea of where he might be. He had mentioned, in passing, that he liked to clear his mind at a small cafe nearby, a quiet place tucked between old buildings where the scent of fresh pastries lingered in the air. When they arrived, their footsteps slowed. Through the window, they spotted him sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him, his gaze focused on something outside. He looked calm, composed, as if the day's events had not touched him at all. But they knew better. They knew that what had happened in that kitchen had left a mark. The instructor was the first to step inside, followed by Marie and Mathieu. The others lingered at the entrance, uncertain, hesitant. Antoine glanced up as the bell above the door chimed, his expression unreadable as he took in the group standing before him. The instructor cleared his throat. Antoine. Antoine set his cup down. Chef. There was a pause, heavy with everything unsaid. The instructor shifted on his feet before finally speaking. We found the truffle. Antoine's expression didn't change. I see. The words hung between them, an acknowledgement, but nothing more. He wasn't going to make this easy for them, and he had every right not to. The instructor hesitated, then took a breath. We were wrong. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight. The rest of the class watched, waiting, wondering how Antoine would respond. Marie stepped forward. We didn't give you the benefit of the doubt. We didn't even question whether the accusation was fair. We just assumed. Antoine studied her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to the rest of them. His voice was even when he finally spoke. Why? Mathieu flinched. I don't know. Yes, you do, Antoine said. There was no anger in his voice, just quiet certainty. Mathieu swallowed, his face flushing. Because you don't look like the kind of person who belongs in that class. The words stung, but Antoine only nodded. Exactly. The instructor exhaled slowly. We let our biases cloud our judgment. That's not an excuse, just the truth. Antoine tapped his fingers against the table, considering. Then he nodded. Thank you for saying it. Another pause stretched between them. They had expected him to be angrier, to lash out, to make them sit in their discomfort. Instead, he remained composed, his quiet dignity only making their guilt weigh heavier. Marie hesitated. Can you forgive us? Antoine tilted his head slightly, studying her. Forgiveness isn't something that happens instantly. It's something earned. She nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. Then let us earn it. Antoine considered this, then gave them a small, knowing smile. All right, let's start with dessert. The instructor blinked. What? Antoine stood, smoothing his coat. I assume the lesson continued after I left. What was on the menu? Chocolate soufflé, Marie said. Antoine nodded. Then let's go. I want to see if you got it right. There was a beat of silence before a small laugh escaped Mathieu. It was uncertain, nervous, but when Antoine's smile widened just slightly, the tension broke. They followed him back to the kitchen, not because the past could be erased, but because change had to start somewhere. Part 8. The stunning revelation. Who Antoine really is. The small, unassuming restaurant tucked away in a quiet neighborhood street had always been Antoine's refuge. After the humiliation and hurt of that afternoon's events, he retreated there instinctively, seeking solace in the comforting rhythms of a kitchen he knew intimately. Antoine moved deliberately, each action measured and purposeful, as he began preparing dishes he had perfected over years of dedication and practice. Here, away from judgmental eyes and prejudiced assumptions, he could be himself, free from the burden of proving his worth or justifying his presence. Outside, the evening sun had given way to a soft twilight, streetlights casting a warm glow through the restaurant's large windows. Antoine kept his gaze focused on the food, carefully plating each dish with meticulous precision, the elegance of his work in stark contrast to the simplicity of his surroundings. The establishment was modest, a stark difference from the luxurious dining rooms he had once commanded, but its authenticity resonated deeply with him. It reminded him of his roots, of the humble beginnings from which he had climbed, and of the quiet dignity that came from mastering one's craft. As Antoine garnished a plate, sprinkling fresh herbs with practiced finesse, he became aware of a commotion outside. Curious, he glanced up, noticing a group gathering hesitantly near the entrance. The soft murmur of voices carried through the glass, and for a brief moment, Antoine's heart tightened. He recognized them instantly, the students and instructor from the cooking class. A mixture of emotions washed over him, from lingering hurt to cautious curiosity. What had brought them here, after everything that had happened? Antoine set down his utensils and stepped back, quietly observing as they debated among themselves before finally deciding to enter. The bell above the door jingled softly, breaking the restaurant's peaceful ambiance as the group filed in awkwardly, their uncertainty palpable. At the forefront stood the instructor, whose face held an expression Antoine had never expected to see, one of profound humility and remorse. Behind him stood Marie, Mathieu, and the rest of the class, each bearing the unmistakable weight of their guilt. A long silence stretched between them, neither side quite knowing how to begin. Antoine waited patiently, his expression composed, offering them neither condemnation nor immediate forgiveness. He understood the power of silence, allowing them space to confront their own discomfort. Finally, it was the instructor who stepped forward, his voice heavy with regret. "We made a terrible mistake, Antoine," he admitted quietly, sincerity evident in the way his voice trembled. "We allowed ignorance and prejudice to cloud our judgment, and we hurt you deeply. You deserved so much better." Antoine studied the instructor carefully, sensing the authenticity in his words. He saw the remorse etched into the lines of the older man's face, his pride replaced with genuine humility. Marie stepped forward next, her eyes moist with unshed tears as she addressed Antoine directly. "We judged you unfairly, without truly seeing you. We acted from ignorance, and in doing so, we betrayed everything culinary arts stand for: respect, integrity, and openness," Marie said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Mathieu, standing just behind Marie, nodded in agreement, his expression sincere, yet hesitant. "We didn't just wrong you," he added, his voice gentle but firm. "We wronged ourselves by allowing prejudice to blind us. Antoine, you taught us more through your dignity and grace than we ever learned in class." Antoine listened quietly, allowing their words to sink in. He felt the heaviness in the room, a shared understanding of the gravity of their actions. Yet he also recognized something else: genuine growth. These individuals, who had once been strangers bound by a common prejudice, now stood united in their determination to acknowledge their errors and seek redemption. It was a moment Antoine had experienced too often, being underestimated, misunderstood, judged unfairly because of something beyond his control. But each of these moments had taught him resilience, empathy, and the importance of rising above ignorance with grace. Here stood another opportunity, not merely to forgive, but to educate, to use his experience as a catalyst for deeper understanding. Finally, Antoine broke the silence. His voice was calm yet firm, carrying the quiet strength of someone who had confronted adversity countless times before. "I came to your class seeking inspiration, looking for an environment where passion and knowledge could flourish freely. Instead, I found suspicion and exclusion," Antoine began thoughtfully. "But perhaps this painful lesson was necessary, not just for me, but for all of us. Maybe it needed to happen so that together we could confront the truths we often ignore." His words resonated deeply, and the group listened intently, recognizing their own biases mirrored back to them. Antoine continued, his voice softening slightly. "When you saw me, you didn't see a chef. You saw my color, my difference, and immediately decided I didn't belong," Antoine said gently, without bitterness. "The fact is, I am the same man who earned Michelin stars, who is celebrated internationally, but none of that mattered when faced with your prejudices. This tells us all something important about how deeply embedded these biases are within us." The instructor lowered his gaze, absorbing Antoine's words fully. "We're here because we recognize our mistake, and because we want to change." Antoine paused, allowing the sincerity of their collective intention to permeate the moment. He felt hopeful, not simply because they had acknowledged their mistake, but because they had chosen to confront it head-on. That was the first step toward meaningful change. Understanding and acknowledging are powerful acts, Antoine finally said, offering them a gentle, genuine smile. But true redemption comes through actions, not just apologies. If you really want to change, carry this lesson beyond this restaurant, beyond our interaction. Challenge yourselves to see people clearly, beyond stereotypes and assumptions. Make sure what happened to me doesn't happen again, to anyone. A quiet murmur of agreement passed among the group. The atmosphere shifted from tense discomfort to reflective openness. Antoine, sensing the transformation beginning, stepped forward, bridging the physical and emotional distance between them. You came here seeking forgiveness, but true forgiveness lies in your future actions, Antoine said warmly, extending his hand toward the instructor. Let today be a new beginning, not just for you, but for all of us. The instructor took Antoine's hand firmly, a silent promise exchanged in that simple gesture. Around them, the others nodded earnestly, deeply moved by Antoine's wisdom and generosity. They understood clearly now. The true lesson wasn't in culinary technique or tradition, but in human dignity, empathy, and humility. As Antoine welcomed them warmly into his humble restaurant, inviting them to taste dishes born from passion and authenticity, the students realized the depth of their oversight. They saw clearly what they had missed from the start. Antoine was not just a chef. He was an artist, a mentor, a man whose greatness transcended accolades and fame. In that small restaurant, under the gentle glow of dim lights, something beautiful emerged from pain, an understanding, a mutual respect, a commitment to change. Antoine had revealed not only his identity as a renowned chef, but something far more valuable: the profound truth that humanity, when freed from prejudice, has the extraordinary capacity to grow, heal, and flourish. And as they tasted the dishes Antoine prepared, each infused with the depth of his story, they finally grasped the essence of cooking itself, a profound act of connection, of culture, of respect. Antoine hadn't simply cooked a meal. He had served them a powerful lesson about the dignity inherent in every human heart. Part 9. A shift in perception. The moment when Antoine's identity finally came to light, when the teacher and her students realized that the very man they had dismissed and marginalized was actually a celebrated 3-star Michelin chef, unleashed a wave of collective introspection that none of them had anticipated. Gone was the smug certainty in their assumptions, replaced by a quiet astonishment that they had been so thoroughly mistaken. The gravity of the realization hung in the kitchen like a dense fog, pressing in on each person's heart and mind with an almost palpable weight. It was as if, in a single instant, all the tiny voices of doubt, prejudice, and fear that had guided their earlier behavior were silenced. In their place came the inexorable truth: skill and passion could flourish in anyone, regardless of skin color, and they had been too blinded by bias to acknowledge that fact. Nobody spoke at first. The clang of pots and the steady hum of appliances receded into the background, dissolving into the hush that fell over the room as Antoine's name echoed in everyone's mind. He was not some aimless novice to be scorned, nor a mere hobbyist meddling with sophisticated French recipes. Rather, he was a luminary whose talents had drawn reverence in the most demanding culinary circles across the globe. The teacher herself, who prided herself on having a finely tuned sense for genuine culinary brilliance, felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. How had she missed this? How had she, with all her experience, overlooked the profound skill residing right in front of her? Most unsettling to them all was the realization that their oblivion was not purely accidental. They had collectively decided that Antoine, being a black man in their traditional French cooking class, could not be genuine. That his perspective, his carefully considered insights, were but intrusions, rather than valuable contributions. The teacher especially remembered the moments she had dismissed him, ignoring his polite suggestions and meeting his sophisticated techniques with chilly skepticism. The revelation of Antoine's true identity cast those moments into sharp relief, exposing the tangled roots of prejudice that had taken hold in her approach to teaching. A hush lingered, and it was Antoine who shattered the silence. Instead of accusations or reproach, he addressed them calmly, expressing a steady, measured disappointment that weighed more heavily on their consciences than anger ever could. He spoke of how he had come to the class anonymously in search of renewed inspiration, desiring to strip away the pomp of his established reputation and reconnect with the basics of French cuisine. He wanted to relive the thrill of hands-on learning, of being a student again, feeling the humility and wonder that accompany a new challenge. Never, he confessed quietly, had he expected to meet such immediate and unanimous doubt about his capabilities, let alone outright hostility. The teacher recalled how, just hours earlier, she had offered the class a hasty explanation for dismissing him, citing a need to uphold the integrity of the lessons. But now, she realized with a sinking heart, she had upheld only her own narrow-mindedness. What kind of integrity was it that turned away someone whose obvious mastery far outstripped that of anyone else in the room? She felt her breath catch, shame mingling with an odd sense of relief that the truth had finally come to the surface. One by one, the students approached Antoine, each wearing a look that blended admiration with regret. A few stammered awkward apologies. Others, like Marie, struggled to articulate the profound shift that had just taken place inside them. She found her voice eventually, admitting that she had initially seen Antoine's presence as intrusive, a man who didn't fit their preconceived image of who belonged in a French gourmet class. Yet now, in the afterglow of her epiphany, she recognized that her concept of belonging had been dictated by biases she had never questioned. Talent and drive, she realized, are universal currencies, unbound by race or origin. Mathieu, who had initially joked about whether Antoine knew anything at all about French cuisine, could not hide the trembling in his voice. He recalled the unspoken prejudice he had carried around, small perhaps when viewed individually, but forming a massive barrier to empathy when accumulated over time. In the face of Antoine's actual standing as a lauded chef, all those doubts now seemed not just petty, but absurd. Yes, Antoine knew French cooking, arguably better than any of them combined. The realization that he had treated a respected professional with such dismissive contempt gnawed at him. In this newly silent, reflective environment, someone moved to the stove to switch it off. An instinctive act, as the lesson was clearly suspended. The teacher turned to Antoine, her voice unsteady with emotion. She started to speak, but faltered, trying to form words that could encompass the magnitude of her remorse. Finally, she said, "I can't begin to tell you how wrong we were, how wrong I was." The sincerity in her tone rang through the quiet. Antoine simply inclined his head, accepting her words but offering no immediate comfort. He wasn't one to revel in their discomfort, but he also knew that hurried reassurance would deprive them of the reckoning they needed to face. Still, he felt compelled to ensure they understood that this was bigger than one moment of correction. It was about dismantling the unspoken structures of prejudice that had shaped their quick condemnation of him, not just smoothing over the immediate tension with an apology. His gentle but firm voice resonated through the subdued room. He reminded them how quickly they had leapt to conclude that he was out of place. He pointed out that in their interactions it wasn't just his opinions they had been scorning. It was the depth of his experiences, his years of study, and his intrinsic mastery of the culinary arts. The entire class grew quieter, their gazes cast downward. He wasn't tearing into them with anger. He was offering them a mirror, forcing them to confront a reflection of themselves they had long pretended wasn't there. From that day forward, every slice of the knife and every swirl of sauce would carry a little more reverence, a reminder that they were part of something larger, a testament to what can happen when closed minds finally open. By the end of the evening, Antoine felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope. Hope that the prejudice he had faced might pave the way for deeper understanding and unity. In that, he found renewed purpose. And the student in the back, one who had joined in the initial mocking, cleared his throat. With trembling earnestness, he said, We never should have treated you that way. We see that now. I see that. But how do we move forward?" The question hung in the air, heavy yet hopeful. It signaled that they weren't merely wallowing in regret. They wanted a path to transformation. Antoine offered a measured nod. He had encountered many situations like this throughout his career, each one carrying its own sting. But something about this moment felt different. Here was a group of people genuinely seeking to change. He began explaining that the first step was to acknowledge that prejudice had crept into their cooking space, supposedly a domain of shared passion and artistry, and overshadowed the very values they claimed to respect, like creativity, curiosity, and cultural exchange. He spoke of how, in fine dining, chefs often fuse global flavors, bridging traditions and forging innovative experiences. Yet, ironically, the same people who celebrate cross-cultural cuisine can also harbor quiet biases that keep them from truly honoring the diversity of those who shape such culinary landscapes. This class, he said, could have been a space for shared growth, for an exchange of insights. Instead, it became another battleground where my identity was placed on trial, without my consent and without due cause. Tears brimmed in Marie's eyes as she recalled the moment she had joined in deriding his suggestions. She realized now how their prejudice had robbed them of valuable insights from a master of the craft. The instructor, swallowing hard, stepped up to Antoine, this time with a posture that conveyed humility rather than authority. "We need your help," he said quietly. "All of us do. Because if we don't learn from this, then what happened here will just happen again." A sense of solidarity began to form among the students. Where once there had been rancor and suspicion, there was now an earnest desire to listen, to unlearn their biases, and to re-educate themselves about the essence of art, technique, and respect that transcends superficial boundaries. Antoine, watching their transformation, nodded slowly. "I'll help, but I'm not here to fix what you broke. You have to do that part yourselves. I can only show you a different way of seeing me, and seeing each other." In that admission, there was both a release and a challenge. He wouldn't let them off the hook easily. Their responsibility was to change, to question the underpinnings of every prejudice-laced thought that cropped up in their minds from now on. From the shifting expressions on their faces, it was clear they felt the weight of his condition. But in that weight, they also discovered the potential for growth, the chance to dismantle not just this single incident's injustice, but the entire mindset that had birthed it. The instructor, his voice uncharacteristically gentle, extended a hand toward Antoine, his earlier arrogance replaced with genuine humility. "If you'd be willing, I'd like you to come back to the class. Show us what we got wrong, not just about you, but about everything that cooking really means." Antoine studied the outstretched hand. He understood that trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight, and neither would the scars vanish instantly. But in that moment, he recognized the sincerity of their request. Slowly, he reached out, clasping the instructor's hand in a gesture of cautious reconciliation. "Cooking," Antoine replied softly, "is about opening oneself up to flavors, to cultures, to people. If we can't do that with open hearts, then we've already failed the dish." A profound hush settled in the kitchen once again, but it was different this time, filled with resolution rather than tension. One by one, the students gathered closer, forming a circle that included Antoine, no one left on the outside. It was a simple symbolic gesture, yet it carried profound meaning. They were in this together now, determined to learn not only from recipes, but also from mistakes that had nearly driven them apart. As the night wore on, they talked, sharing honest confessions, apologizing for words said in haste, and judgments made prematurely. In return, Antoine offered them a glimpse into his journey, his struggles, his triumphs, his reasons for seeking inspiration in the very place that had initially scorned him. And in that exchange, something truly changed within each person. They realized that no technique or skill could ever replace the empathy and respect essential to the craft of cooking. Yes, they had discovered Antoine's revered status as a Michelin-starred chef, but that fact was now secondary to their broader revelation, that true artistry and humanity know no color. The students, for their part, felt transformed, not just as aspiring chefs, but as people determined to cook with open hearts and unburdened minds. Part 10. A Sincere Apology. Antoine had spent the week following his tumultuous experience in the cooking class, trying to focus on the craft he loved, yet he found himself replaying every moment of misunderstanding and judgment in his mind. Even his usual refuge, turning over a new dish in his meticulously equipped kitchen, did little to quell the sense of unfinished business that seemed to hover over him like a dull ache. He had proven his skill, revealed his identity as a 3-star Michelin chef, and walked away with the knowledge that he was not the one who truly needed to change. But the encounter had left a mark, stirring up emotions he believed he had long since mastered. It was in the midst of those lingering doubts that he received a call from Marie, one of the students, her tone trembling with nerves as she asked if she and a few others could come to his restaurant that evening. She didn't offer many details, only that they felt they owed him a debt of honesty. Curiosity and a faint sense of hope washed over him as he agreed. When that evening arrived, Antoine stood at the entrance of his restaurant, greeting patrons with his customary warmth. The space itself was a reflection of his culinary philosophy. Subtle, unpretentious elegance, with soft lighting and minimalist decor that let the food take center stage. He had spent years pouring himself into this place, shaping every detail so that anyone who walked in would feel invited to share in something personal and profound. And now, as he glanced at the door, his heart gave a small lurch. Into the softly lit foyer stepped the teacher from the cooking class, along with Marie and a handful of other students. They moved hesitantly, as if crossing a forbidden threshold. Their eyes scanned the interior, taking in the modern lines and gentle ambiance, some with wonder, some with visible apprehension. For a moment, no one spoke. Antoine broke the silence, striding toward them in the same gracious manner he extended to any of his guests. "Welcome," he said softly, though his voice carried a hint of reserved caution. He wasn't sure how to receive them, nor was he certain they truly recognized the depth of the harm caused. But something in their expressions suggested earnestness, as though they came seeking more than a simple apology. The teacher, usually so poised in a classroom environment, looked uncharacteristically humble. She held her purse tightly, her shoulders tense, and her eyes flicked around the space before meeting Antoine's gaze. "I'm not certain we deserve your hospitality," she began, her voice catching slightly. "But we realized we needed to see you, and we hoped you might let us explain ourselves, properly this time." At her words, the group nodded. Marie, in particular, looked as though she were carrying a heavy weight, the lines of guilt etched plainly on her face. "We know we have no right to ask for your forgiveness," she said, barely above a whisper. "And it's not just that we dismissed your abilities. It's that in doing so, we also dismissed a part of your humanity. That's something I never want to do again." Antoine inclined his head, gesturing them to a private table he had quickly arranged in a discreet corner of the restaurant. He signaled to one of the servers, who brought them water and menus, though it was evident none of the newcomers were quite ready to order anything. Indeed, the tension still held them in an awkward stillness. Once seated, the teacher cleared her throat, nervously interlocking her fingers. She was the first to break the silence. "If I can be honest, I've spent the last few days replaying everything I said and did," she began. "My whole life, I've thought of myself as inclusive, open-minded. I celebrate diversity in theory, but the moment you stepped into my class, I somehow couldn't see past your skin color. I treated you as an intruder in a space that I believed belonged to me and people like me alone. And for that, I am deeply sorry." The sincerity in her voice held a certain trembling fragility, as if she were only just discovering her ability to speak those words. She went on to describe how she had grown up believing that fine French cuisine was a sanctum reserved for a certain group, though she had never quite framed it that explicitly in her own mind. Antoine listened in quiet attention, absorbing her words with a measured gaze. This was more than the usual scripted apology. She seemed to be confronting beliefs she had rarely acknowledged she held. Following the teacher, another student added, "We all admired top-level chefs. Some of us even idolized the mythical Michelin stars. But in practice, we never expected that mastery could come from someone who didn't mirror the classic European mold. That doesn't excuse how we treated you, but it might explain how we allowed ourselves to be so blind. We saw a puzzle piece that didn't fit our preconceived image, and decided it was the piece that was wrong, not our mental image. Her voice shook with regret. I can't imagine how exhausting it must be to live under that kind of scrutiny all the time. A new hush took over the table. Antoine could sense their discomfort, but also their resolve to face it. There had been so much condescension, so many barbed remarks about his place in that cooking class. Yet at this moment, he realized they were truly grappling with the deeper message he had tried to convey. I came to your class, he said gently, because I was searching for a way to rediscover the fundamentals of French cooking, to step away from my own reputation, and remember what made me fall in love with this craft in the first place. I didn't come to prove anything to anyone, but ironically, I ended up having to prove I even belonged. He paused, his voice tightening slightly. If I may speak plainly, I don't blame you for being curious. Curiosity, after all, is what leads to discovery, innovation, and progress. The real issue begins when curiosity hardens into suspicion or prejudice when it says, "There's no way you, a black chef, can teach me about classic cuisine." That's not curiosity, that's limitation. And it's a limitation you place on yourself as much as you place it on me. Marie swallowed hard, nodding. She confessed that ever since the moment Antoine had left the class, she had felt a hollowness every time she tried a new recipe. I couldn't enjoy cooking, couldn't taste the layers of flavor I used to love because I realized I had denied someone else's creativity out of simple bias. The shame of it overshadowed any joy. Another student spoke up, recalling how he had judged Antoine's suggestions as out of place, only to later discover that those very techniques were advanced methods that top-tier chefs often use to create extraordinary dishes. I kept thinking, how dare I assume someone else's ignorance when I had no idea of my own blind spots? He admitted, his eyes darting away momentarily in shame. At that juncture, the teacher mustered the courage to voice the subject she knew they had to address. Antoine, none of this changes the fact that racism is alive and well, even in our little corner of the culinary world. We contributed to that by validating stereotypes, by seeing you as an outsider who had no right to be in our class. We want to do better, but we need your help. Antoine's expression was calm, but tinged with a certain sadness. I'm willing to share knowledge, to cultivate dialogue, but the inner work, unlearning biases and building a new perspective, must start with each of you. I can't do that part for you. He allowed a small sigh. Racism isn't just about hateful words or overt actions. It's the subtle ways you exclude people, by not seeing them as equals, by doubting their capabilities before they even speak. The teacher straightened her posture, determination settling in her eyes. I promise you, we'll do better than words this time. We want to re-invite you to the class, this time as an honored guest, not as a suspect. We'd like you to teach us what we missed, not just about cooking, but about bridging cultures through food. An unmistakable ripple of relief passed through the group. In that invitation lay the recognition of not just Antoine's skill, but also the fact that their biases had previously shut them out of experiences that could have enriched their craft. Yet Antoine hesitated. The memory of standing in that hostile kitchen, being dismissed and belittled, still felt raw. He took a moment to gather his thoughts. I appreciate the invitation, he said slowly, but acceptance is not automatic. I need to see that you've genuinely laid down your preconceived notions, because I will not subject myself to another stage where I have to fight for basic respect. A respectful silence followed. The teacher reached out, her hand trembling slightly. I can't promise instant perfection, but I can promise sincerity and the willingness to learn. I hope that counts for something. The vulnerability in her words was evident. She was opening a path for dialogue that had not existed before. Antoine considered this, reflecting on how each person's humility was perhaps the most potent ingredient in forging meaningful change. It does, he replied, smiling gently. It's a start. He took a breath, recalling how, on that first day, he'd merely wanted to reacquaint himself with the building blocks of French gastronomy. In a way, he was still on that journey, but it had expanded into a broader mission about how acceptance and mutual learning could transform not just one dish, but an entire environment. As they concluded that heartfelt conversation, the tension drained from the group, replaced by a cautious optimism. They took the opportunity to sample a few amuse-bouches from Antoine's kitchen, each bite carrying with it a fresh sense of awe at how seamlessly he fused classical French techniques with unexpected flavors gleaned from his wide travels. The teacher's eyes widened with every taste, aware that these morsels were glimpses of a culinary horizon far larger and more inclusive than she had ever imagined. The students, for their part, found themselves inspired by the sheer creativity brimming from Antoine's compositions, a testament to the brilliance they had nearly rejected out of prejudice. Antoine walked them to the door, a quiet smile on his face. This was far from the end of the conversation, more like a new beginning. He noticed how each student paused before leaving, offering a promise to break the cycle of prejudice they had unwittingly maintained. The teacher lingered last, thanking him not only for listening, but for awakening something in her that had lain dormant, the humility to acknowledge mistakes and the courage to rectify them. Standing by the threshold, watching them depart into the evening lights, Antoine felt a profound sense of exhalation, as though an oppressive weight had shifted. The night air seemed gentler, the glow from the street lamps warmer. He was reminded that cooking, at its best, fosters connection and empathy, values that thrive only when people open their hearts to one another. And while the bruises of that initial rejection hadn't vanished, he could see a path forward, illuminated by the possibility that these individuals might become champions of change rather than perpetuators of bias. Eventually, Antoine returned inside, greeting the next wave of guests with renewed spirit. The day had been draining, yet also uplifting. He realized that the seeds of reconciliation had been planted, and though they demanded careful nurturing, they promised a harvest of unity and respect. He hoped their story would serve as a reminder to everyone who walked into his restaurant, that extraordinary flavors arise not from uniformity, but from the bold interplay of diverse influences. And in that spirit, perhaps, one small corner of the culinary world would become more inclusive, one dish, one lesson, and one conversation at a time. Part 11. The Lesson Learned: Breaking the Cycle of Bias. Antoine's return to the culinary school after that life-altering confrontation was far from triumphant in any traditional sense. There were no dramatic speeches or bright lights showcasing his accolades as a 3-star Michelin chef. Instead, when he quietly stepped back into that kitchen, a place that had once regarded him with suspicion, he was struck by the profound sense of transformation that had begun to germinate in the people who had once judged him so harshly. Their faces displayed no immediate pride or relief. Rather, there was a solemnity in their eyes, a collective understanding that they had all, in some way, partaken in an act of exclusion. It was this shared realization, heavy and yet powerfully motivating, that ushered in a lesson far deeper than any recipe or culinary technique. They had come to understand that true growth did not spring from performance or reputation, but from an honest desire to break away from the limitations of prejudice, replacing them with genuine openness and empathy. On the day he re-entered that class, there was an air of anticipation, as though the entire space was holding its breath. The teacher, once so dismissive of Antoine's insights, now hovered at the edge of the counter, uncertainty replacing her old smugness. She was the first to speak, offering a few brief, stumbling words of welcome. Then she stepped aside, symbolically relinquishing the spotlight that she once used as a barrier to keep him, and his ideas, at a distance. Even the classmates who had once witnessed and, by their inaction, condoned his mistreatment seemed different. Some fidgeted with their aprons, others stared at the cutting boards in front of them, not out of shame alone, but out of a real resolve to approach Antoine's presence with an open heart this time. Antoine absorbed these changes quietly, acknowledging the subtleties of their new attitudes. This was no comfortable apology where each side pretended everything had been resolved. The conversation unfolding in that kitchen went beyond words. It was in the hesitant gestures, the reflective looks, and the conscious efforts each person made to shift their perspective. The transformation felt fragile, as though a misstep could send them all tumbling back into old habits. Yet that fragility was precisely what made it meaningful. To Antoine, a profound lesson was taking root. That humility is a crucial prerequisite for dismantling bias. Through a series of small but meaningful moments, he observed how the teacher took special care not to shut down any of his suggestions. Instead of labeling his approaches as non-traditional, she now asked him probing questions, as though acknowledging that her own knowledge was incomplete. Where she had once shielded the class from his so-called unorthodox methods, she now encouraged everyone to watch as he demonstrated how a chef might blend French and African influences in a single dish without losing the essence of either. Rather than arguments, there were thoughtful inquiries. Rather than silent hostility, there was a collective sense of curiosity. And rather than justifying old prejudices, they tested new ways to understand and incorporate his approach to cooking, thereby learning more about themselves in the process. One afternoon, in the midst of a practice session on sauces, a soft-spoken classmate named Gabrielle approached Antoine. Prior to his initial confrontation, she had barely acknowledged him. Now, she confessed that she once believed that classical French cuisine could only be perfected by those who had grown up immersed in that tradition. She admitted that she had, from the outset, dismissed Antoine as someone who couldn't possibly grasp the nuances of French culinary heritage. Her voice caught as she explained how his calm resilience had made her question her assumptions. That questioning, she said, was uncomfortable but also freeing. It forced her to consider her own biases, the casual remarks she had grown up with, and the sense of ownership she felt over a culinary tradition that she now realized was bigger than her personal narrative. Antoine responded not with chastisement, but with empathy. He shared that even as a boy he'd found a powerful connection to the textures and tastes of French cuisine, despite growing up in a very different setting. Cooking, he believed, was never about fences. It was about bridges, about forging links among people, places, and flavors that sometimes seemed worlds apart. Similar revelations emerged from other students. The once boastful individuals who had belittled his presence came forward, acknowledging how their assumptions about him had been shaped by stereotypes that extended beyond the kitchen. It became clear that Antoine's humiliating experience wasn't an isolated event, but a reflection of a broader mindset, a pattern that had slipped under the surface of their daily routines. Each one realized the times they might have passively contributed to exclusion, whether by laughing at an offhand remark or turning a blind eye to microaggressions in their personal lives. Their revelations were raw, and with each realization came an apology. Yet these apologies were not all about Antoine. They were also a call to action for them to break from their own complicity and to be braver in confronting prejudice whenever and wherever it arose. There were also lighthearted instances that sprinkled hope into the environment. One day, after class, a small group invited Antoine to join them for coffee at a nearby cafe. In this casual setting, the conversation flowed more freely. They asked him about his journey, how he had discovered his passion for cooking, the nooks and crannies of his cultural influences, and what it felt like to be on the receiving end of Michelin acclaim. These weren't the superficial inquiries from before. They were genuine attempts to connect. Laughing over pastries, they found themselves bonding over shared human experiences, the pressure of pleasing a discerning audience, the nights when a recipe refused to come together, the crippling self-doubt that could gnaw at the confidence of even the most skilled chef. It was in these unguarded moments that they recognized what they had missed earlier, that the differences they once feared or dismissed could actually enrich their collective understanding of food and, by extension, of each other. Slowly, Antoine began to see the space transform into something more intimate and caring. When he spoke in class, he wasn't met with skepticism or blank stares, but with open minds. The teacher herself would often pause to ask him to elaborate, to show them how he fused a certain West African spice technique with a classic sauce reduction, or how he balanced pungent, layered flavors with French minimalism. There was a sincerity in the way they all leaned in to watch, carefully noting each detail. And at the end of each session, they no longer rushed out. Instead, they lingered, sometimes for hours, dissecting flavors and experiences, forging a newly inclusive sense of community. In that transformation, a lesson was imprinted into every aspect of their interactions. That culinary tradition, much like society, could be stifled by rigid gatekeeping, and only by challenging these walls could real creativity thrive. This shift in perspective didn't eradicate the entire legacy of prejudice that had been present. Some attendees never quite relinquished their private reservations, and occasionally Antoine caught glimpses of old biases, the quick flinch of someone underestimating him, or the slip of a condescending remark quickly retracted. Yet the changes that had been set in motion were tangible. They had learned, at least, to recognize the weight of such slights, and to see them not as trivial habits, but as obstacles to real human connection. Antoine himself grew in this environment, realizing that acceptance and empathy could originate even from those who once seemed hopelessly trapped in prejudice. What emerged from the tension and the subsequent reconciliation was a deeper wisdom that each participant carried outside the classroom walls. The teacher, once steadfast in her belief that tradition should be guarded against outside influence, found herself encouraging cross-cultural experiments. Students who had believed that perfection could only come from replicating classical formulas discovered that creativity required unshackling the mind from such limitations. More pointedly, each person came to see the importance of recognizing that brilliance knows no single origin, and that diversity in the kitchen and beyond is not a threat, but a treasure trove of untapped possibilities. In the end, Antoine's presence and his willingness to persist in that environment, despite the hostility he initially encountered, turned into a catalyst. He had not intended to be an example of resilience or a speaker for social justice. He simply wanted, in the quiet corners of his own pursuit of excellence, to recapture the sparks of inspiration that first made him love French cuisine. Yet his challenges illuminated for everyone the subtle ways in which prejudice and exclusion erode creativity and block genuine human exchange. And from that illumination arose an unmistakable call to change, one that found a powerful voice in every future lesson and each new recipe they tackled. By the closing weeks of the course, Antoine and the class had crafted a shared dish, an emblem of cross-cultural fusion that melded a classic French technique with flavors from African traditions dear to Antoine. The final product was more than an innovative recipe. It became a token of transformation and collaboration, a testament to what could be accomplished when hearts and minds opened to each other's stories and expertise. Tasting that dish for the first time, the teacher felt a swelling of emotion well up inside her. It was, in her own words, the flavor of humility meeting renewal, a taste that lingered not just on the palate, but in the soul. As the course drew to a close, no grand ceremony was held to mark the changes that had transpired. Instead, the true celebration was in the intangible shifts that would outlive any formal farewell. The teacher's approach to leadership had changed. The students had discovered that skill and creativity recognized no boundaries of color or background. And Antoine, ironically, rediscovered the excitement in French cooking that he had long sought. They all knew this transformation remained a work in progress, that prejudice doesn't vanish overnight, and that every day would bring fresh opportunities to either fall back into old mindsets or to continue reaching out for greater understanding. Yet that, in essence, was the deeper meaning embedded in the entire experience. Growth is never about the final moment of triumph. It's about the day-by-day vigilance we employ to keep prejudice from creeping back in, to hold ourselves and one another accountable, and to remember that what we gain from inclusivity is far richer than any ephemeral sense of control that bigotry can bestow. They had learned that acknowledging their mistakes was only the first step. Building on that acknowledgement, forging new paths in both their personal and culinary journeys, was the challenge they now had the heart to embrace. And with that shared meal, a confluence of flavors, perspectives, and traditions, they symbolized their collective vow to cherish diversity, not just as a convenient slogan, but as a living, breathing ingredient essential to the recipe of life. Part 12, A Call for Change and Antoine's Mission. Antoine never sought to become a symbol. He had spent his life dedicated to his craft, perfecting each dish with the precision of an artist, believing that food was a universal language that transcended borders, race, and prejudice. Yet, as he stood in his restaurant's kitchen, the weight of the past few weeks settled upon him. The lessons he had learned, the battles he had fought, some silently, others more painfully, had led him to an inescapable truth. His story was bigger than himself. What had begun as a personal journey to rediscover his passion for cooking had transformed into something more significant. It had become a testament to resilience, a confrontation with bias, and ultimately, a lesson in change. The moment he revealed his identity to his former classmates and teacher had not been one of arrogance or revenge. He had not done it to shame them or to assert his superiority. Rather, it was an invitation for them to reconsider the assumptions they had held, to question the rigid beliefs that had led them to dismiss him so quickly. And in that moment, he saw in their faces something unexpected, genuine regret. The realization that they had let their prejudice blind them to talent, that they had allowed an arbitrary barrier, one they may not have even been fully conscious of, to dictate how they treated another person. Antoine knew that regret alone was not enough. Regret without action was useless. He had encountered it before. People who acknowledged discrimination but did nothing to dismantle it. People who apologized in private, but remained silent when confronted with injustice in the world. He did not want to be a mere cautionary tale to them, another story that faded with time. He wanted his experience to leave a lasting mark, not just on those who had wronged him, but on the broader culinary world. He had spent years breaking barriers, earning his Michelin stars not through privilege, but through relentless dedication. And yet, even with his achievements, he was still seen first as a black man, an outsider in the world of French cuisine. That fact alone was enough to remind him that success was not always a shield against bias. He had been tolerated by the culinary elite because of his undeniable talent. But even then, there were whispers, doubters who saw his presence in their industry as an exception rather than a rightful place. And if that was how they treated someone of his stature, he could only imagine what it was like for aspiring black chefs who lacked his credentials, who faced locked doors before they even had the chance to prove themselves. So, Antoine made a decision. He would no longer just cook for the sake of perfecting his craft. He would use his platform to amplify voices that had been silenced for too long. He would carve a path so that the next generation would not have to fight as hard as he had. And it started with one simple yet powerful idea: visibility. The first step was within his own restaurant. He had always prided himself on excellence, but now he wanted to redefine what excellence looked like. He sought out young, ambitious chefs of color who had been overlooked by prestigious culinary schools, those who had been rejected from top-tier kitchens because they did not fit the unspoken mold of what a French chef was supposed to be. He invited them into his kitchen, not as a charity act, but because he knew talent was not dictated by race or background. Given the right mentorship, they would flourish. Beyond his restaurant, he took his story to the world. He spoke at culinary schools, challenging their outdated views on tradition. He held workshops that celebrated the intersection of cultures in cuisine, proving that innovation did not mean disrespecting heritage. It meant expanding it, enriching it. He partnered with organizations that worked to break down barriers in fine dining, ensuring that aspiring chefs of all backgrounds had opportunities that had once been denied to people like him. Antoine's efforts were met with both admiration and resistance. There were those who celebrated his mission, who recognized the necessity of his work. But there were also those who scoffed, who saw his advocacy as an attack rather than an invitation. Some traditionalists accused him of being too radical, of trying to force change in an industry that prided itself on centuries-old customs. They told him that the system had worked just fine before, that if black chefs were truly deserving, they would rise naturally. He had heard it all before. The myth of meritocracy. The illusion that talent alone was enough to break through barriers that had been carefully constructed over generations. He refused to be deterred. Instead, he doubled down. He used his influence to launch a mentorship program that connected young chefs of color with established professionals who were committed to diversity. He worked with restaurant owners to create hiring policies that actively sought out underrepresented talent. He collaborated with food critics and journalists, encouraging them to broaden their scope, to highlight culinary brilliance beyond the traditionally celebrated establishments. His impact began to ripple. Slowly, he saw shifts in the industry. small at first, but undeniable. Restaurants that had once been homogeneous began to embrace diversity, not just in their staff, but in their menus, in their philosophies. Schools that had once dismissed non-traditional approaches began incorporating new perspectives into their curriculum. And most importantly, young chefs who had once doubted their place in fine dining now saw a future for themselves. Antoine never sought to be a symbol, but he became one nonetheless, not because he was exceptional, but because his story was universal. His journey was not just about food, it was about identity, about belonging, about the right to exist in spaces that had long been denied to people like him. And by refusing to accept the status quo, by challenging an industry that had resisted change for so long, he had done more than reclaim his own dignity. He had paved the way for others to do the same. Years later, when he looked out at the chefs working in his kitchen, some from backgrounds as diverse as his own, each of them bringing their own unique experiences and influences to their craft, he realized that his greatest achievement was not the Michelin stars on the wall or the accolades he had received. It was this: the knowledge that his presence had made it just a little bit easier for the next Antoine, the next aspiring chef who dared to dream beyond the limitations society had set for them. And with that realization, he knew his work was far from over. Because change, real change, was not a moment. It was a movement that would continue long after him, in the kitchens, in the classrooms, in the hands of every chef who refused to be defined by anything other than their passion for the art of cooking. Antoine's story is more than just a tale of perseverance in the face of injustice. It is a powerful reflection of the world we live in, a world where talent and dedication are too often overshadowed by bias and prejudice. His journey through rejection, humiliation, and ultimate redemption is not unique to him. It is a struggle that many face daily in countless industries and communities. But his response, his refusal to be defined by the narrow perceptions of others, is what makes his story so impactful. At its core, this is a story about the power of resilience and the importance of challenging the status quo. Antoine did not allow the ignorance of others to diminish his self-worth. He did not let their rejection convince him that he was less deserving. Instead, he took control of his own narrative, proving that excellence cannot be confined to a single definition, nor can it be restricted by outdated traditions. His triumph was not simply in proving his doubters wrong. It was in inspiring change, in shifting mindsets, in paving the way for future generations who will no longer have to fight the same battles he did. One of the greatest lessons from Antoine's experience is that success is not just about personal achievement. It is about lifting others up along the way. It would have been easy for him to walk away from the world that had dismissed him, to bask in his own accomplishments, and ignore the structural inequalities that held others back. But he chose a different path. He used his platform to demand better, to demand inclusivity, to create opportunities for those who, like him, had once been overlooked. His story reminds us that real change requires action. Acknowledging bias is not enough. We must actively work to dismantle it. Another critical takeaway is the importance of visibility. Representation matters. The reason Antoine's presence in that classroom was met with skepticism was because people had been conditioned to believe that black chefs did not belong in the elite world of French cuisine. That belief persisted because there were not enough examples to challenge it. Antoine understood that by stepping into the light, by claiming his space unapologetically, he was not just fighting for himself, he was making it easier for others to follow. When people see someone who looks like them succeeding in a field that has historically excluded them, it plants a seed of possibility. It tells them that they too belong. Perhaps the most powerful message of this story is the transformative power of education. Not just formal education, but the willingness to learn, unlearn, and grow. The students and instructor who dismissed Antoine learned a painful but necessary lesson, that their biases had blinded them to the truth. And in the end, their willingness to confront that mistake, to seek forgiveness, and to change their perspectives is a reminder that growth is always possible. But growth requires humility. It requires acknowledging where we have been wrong and making a conscious effort to do better. Antoine's journey is not just his own. It is a call to action for all of us. It challenges us to examine our own biases, to question the systems we participate in, and to actively create a more just and inclusive world. His story is a testament to the fact that progress is possible, but only if we have the courage to fight for it. If Antoine's story has inspired you, if you believe in the fight for equality, if you want to be part of a movement that amplifies voices and breaks barriers, then join us. Subscribe to Civil Rights Fight today. Be part of the conversation. Be part of the change. Because the fight for justice and equality doesn't end with one person. It continues with all of us.